Dealing with Disasters, Professional Myths and Social Realities. A 38-minute presentation sponsored by the Department of Defence Management and Security Analysis, held at Wellington Hall, Shrivenham, on the 12th of January 2006. The speaker is Mr. Bill Durodie, who is a senior lecturer in Risk and Corporate Security at the Resilience Centre of the Royal Military College of Science, part of the Defence Academy of the United Kingdom. He was previously Senior Research Fellow in the Centre for Defence Studies and Director of the International Centre for Security Analysis at King's College London, having been educated at Imperial College, the London School of Economics and New College, Oxford. His research, examining the causes and consequences of social perceptions of risk, has been widely published. Bill Durodie.
Everything I'm going to say is available online. It's on my website, which is www.durodie, which is spelled Durodie.net. All my publications are there. And it's essentially based on one core publication, which is called The Limitations of Risk Management. And a kind of pre-seed version of it also appeared in the slightly notorious Chatham House paper that was published last summer, that got a lot of flack for suggesting that British foreign policy was, quote, riding pillion on American foreign policy. And I had the second paper in that, which was called Terrorism and Community Resilience. So that's available through Chatham House as well. It's also on my website. Where I want to start is to just, because I think people become very lazy, and it's a good starting point is to question what a disaster actually is, because it's not obvious. In fact, I would argue that nothing is obvious, and if one wanted to be really philosophical about it, I would argue against Kant's notion that there is such a thing as a thing in itself, or Ding an sich, and remind people that it might be worth reading more Hegel, where you understand that things are only things in relationship to other things. And actually a really good example, which is going to seem incredibly tangential, but I think it's quite insightful, of this was drawn to my attention this week in relation to the debate supposedly about binge drinking. So is there such a thing as binge drinking? And we all know that, we've all seen the pictures of people doing horrible things in the street. But in fact, there's very little evidence for any of this, because actually what there has been is a shift in how culture presumes we behave when we're drunk. How we behave when we're drunk depends on cultural values and how we see other people behave when they're drunk, and we pick up cues. And whereas, when I was a young person who drank too much, the assumption was that you should hold your drink, and therefore the point was to drink as much as possible but not show it. In a society that's become much more touchy-feely and, let it all out and express yourself, people, I suspect, drink only half as much and yet behave like lunatics. And ironically, that's got nothing to do with the drink. It's got to do with our culture and how we presume people behave when they're drunk. And the reason I raise that, and the reason it might seem a bit bizarre, is because I think it's important to understand that what a disaster is also has to do with our culture and how we presume people behave, or what kind of emergencies we presume to label as being disastrous. And that cultural context is also politically contested, or not, as the case may be, in an age when we don't contest political ideas. A good example, if we want to go right back to the Lisbon Earthquake of 1755, that happened pretty much halfway through the kind of Enlightenment period of people debating everything and putting man or humanity at the centre of the universe. And the fallout of the Lisbon Earthquake, which was quite a kind of, in many ways, the first kind of world disaster, in as much as everybody got to hear about it, was a debate between the kind of deists and theists and religious believers and secularists, and obviously the people of a religious bent were saying that this was God's vengeance for humanity's depraved behaviour, whereas the new optimistic, humanistic secularists were saying this is natural and people can overcome things. That's what humanity's about. So in fact, interestingly enough, it's a debate between pessimists and optimists. And the point I would make, and maybe we can pick up on this in the discussion, is that we increasingly live in a pessimistic age. And also that events are not debated as much as they used to be, as our politics becomes increasingly of a single colour, that one being grey, as far as I'm concerned. And therefore, if we are, as a society, increasingly prone to focus on negative things, and we don't debate them, then anything and everything can become a disaster. And worse than that, our response has increasingly become technically focused, rather than understanding these things in the kind of social and cultural context that I've tried to raise it in, and trying to address the social roots of what a disaster is or how we respond to emergencies. If we are purely technical in how we address emergencies, and I'll come back to this later on in the discussion, we can actually make things much worse, because an emergency is not just a technical thing. Now, if any of you have done any risk management ever, you may have been taught that risk, supposedly, is the product of probability of an event and its impact. You have this kind of standard risk equation, probability times impact, which is a good way of measuring things if you can measure them. But in fact, you have to bear in mind that how we perceive things to be risky, our subjective perception, may have little to do with actual probabilities or actual impacts, but is rather a subjective, emotional effect, which again is socially determined. And that perception is affected by various things like our sense of confidence in society and where it's going, our trust in public authorities. If we live in an age when we don't trust public authorities, then we will perceive things maybe to be more out of control than we would otherwise, despite the fact that they may be no more out of control than ever before and possibly more under control. It's also affected by our, as I've already mentioned, our degree of optimism. But above all, I would argue, on our sense of purpose, which is an issue that's not particularly discussed nowadays. In fact, our purpose used to be what the root of all political debate was about. When politics used to be divided between a socialist left and a free market right, it was based on what is our vision of a good society. And a society which loses its sense of purpose ends up dealing with risk as an end in itself. Risk management becomes the end of everything we're doing. We have to control risks, whatever they are, terrorist attacks and tsunamis, earthquakes, rather than understanding that risk management is a means to achieving a broader end, which is what we would say is the purpose of society or the purpose of our lives. And just if you haven't quite got that, the example I would give is that if you're a policeman or a fireman or whatever, or a person, or you serve in the military, you don't fight fires or fight wars so that your children can grow up to fight fires or fight wars. Presumably you do those things because you think that there is something more important to life that makes it worth overcoming these immediate problems and makes it worth fighting for. But we now live in an age when people are not discussing what that something more important to life is. So actually you just go through an endless cycle of continuously just dealing with emergencies. And risk management becomes an end in itself rather than a means to achieving a broader end. So I'd argue that there's, the absence of any debate as to our direction or our social values may leave us in a position where we're technically more competent than any previous society for dealing with disasters, but morally disarmed and unarmed because we don't know why we do what we do. And that sense of confidence is very important because at the end of the day, resilience, and I work in the Resilience Centre, is not a piece of kit that you can go into a shop and buy, but is much more a cultural attitude or individual outlook as to how you deal with adversity in your life. And that's not something that you can just conjure up. In the paper that I mentioned at the beginning, what I do is I look at why it is that in certain societies, in certain periods, what to us might appear to be extreme emergencies or serious disasters hardly register in popular consciousness, Whereas increasingly nowadays, smaller and smaller things become perceived as disastrous. So as it happens, I think 60 people die a week on the roads of the United Kingdom, something that's rarely discussed and just seen to be the norm. Interestingly enough, 52 people, other than terrorists, died on the 7th of July on one day last year. Since then, more than that number have died week in, week out on the roads. But that's not seen as particularly an issue, whereas obviously we're completely fixated and obsessed on how to deal with terrorism. Similarly, in the 1950s, in 1952, there was a London smog. There were numerous instances of London smog, but in 52 it killed thousands on one night, I think in December 52. And it was just seen as, the cost of industrial progress. And it wasn't, it's not something that people have held in popular memory and discussed as a major catastrophe ever since. On the other hand, more recent episodes, like, everybody knows where they were when the Challenger space shuttle blew up. And yet only 7 people died. And that registered as a major disaster. Or the Hatfield rail crash, maybe a bit less significantly, but still, again, quite significant in popular consciousness, where 4 people died. And if you look at the whole history of disasters and you begin to analyse how societies respond to them, what you find is that what we call a disaster has got nothing to do with the number of lives lost. And it has very little to do with the financial cost either. What we call a disaster, what we define as a disaster, is based entirely on the social meaning that we apply to what has happened. And whether that meaning shakes up our sense of meaning about our own society. I would suggest that Challenger was quite important because it fed into a growing critique of science and technology and the assumption that science and technology was limitless and that we could reach for the stars, and it kind of began a process, or fed into a process that's accelerated to this day, of critiquing the ambitions of science, and has fed into a kind of mistrust of our technical competence. Hatfield was also quite important because it occurred at a time when it fed public cynicism about government and the privatisation of the railways. So it fed a certain mistrust of politics and a mistrust of private corporations. And it's, those are some of the reasons why those things, we attribute greater meaning to them than they have in themselves. In themselves, 4 lives lost, 7 lives lost. It doesn't have to be a disaster. In other words, emergencies and disasters take on a different role or have a different impact according to how we as a society interpret those events and how we use those events to, either shape the future or control things. Last year, of course, was a year marked by a number of disasters in a way. You had the tsunami from the start of the year, still echoing on. You then had the earthquake in northern Pakistan and Hurricane Katrina, amongst others. And it's interesting when you look at the kind of media commentary on these events, because a lot of it's been interpreted as emblematic of the impact that humanity has on the planet, and that this is why, now it's almost like nature's vengeance is being held up by these events. And yet, of course, those events do not have to be interpreted that way at all. In fact, in a way, it's a sign of our crisis of humanist confidence that we go back to almost a kind of pre-political, kind of mythical, nature has got a mind of its own way of looking at things. There's a huge literature now suggesting that, in fact, it would be a great thing if there was some kind of plague, there's a plague, obviously avian flu feeds into all of that. But this assumption that nature's revenge is on its way, which I think reflects much more to do with a crisis of confidence in humanity than it has anything to do with nature. But, the earthquake in Pakistan, for instance, was significantly less on the Richter scale, as we know, than the Kobe earthquake in Japan. And yet Kobe kills, very few people and has far less of an impact. And if anything, what you can show is that human development and human understanding is the best and only way for dealing with what are natural events. It's also worth bearing in mind, as people are now beginning to debate whether to rebuild New Orleans, and the assumption is that seeing as most of it's below sea level, it's a stupid place apparently to build a city. It's worth bearing in mind that 70% of Holland is under sea level. And again, that's got to do with what humanity decides to do and what its sense of confidence and purpose is as to how it goes about doing things. And I've argued elsewhere, and you'll find articles on my website, that how we react to terrorism also, it depends on us how important we turn some of these events. It's not just the terrorists themselves that control us. If you look at the whole history of how human beings behave in emergencies, what you find is that there's a myth being propagated about panic. There's very, very few instances of panic in disasters and emergencies. In fact, the only instances of panic, and there's a paper that I published in The Lancet on my website that covers this, the only instances of panic are in enclosed spaces with a fire. And pretty much everything else, there's no evidence for panic. I mean, the tsunami was, if anything, a great emblem of human courage, cooperation, and people acting quite rationally and in quite a focused way. However, because we live in as I suggested earlier, a slightly pessimistic period, there's a presumption that all sorts of terrible atrocities were going on. So there was a presumption that children were being abused after the tsunami. In fact, the Metropolitan Police, one of their great contributions to the relief effort was to send an army of paedophile-trained officers, what they found when they got there was that, of course, lots of people had taken in children because the children had lost their parents, and they were actually, so what was in fact a sign of, human cooperation and, humanity, because of our twisted interpretation and, how we analyse issues was seen as, potentially negative and being about paedophiles. And similarly, I hope most of you know that all the rumours about rape and pillage in New Orleans after Katrina turned out to be mostly that, rumours. I mean, there's no confirmed incidents of rape. And yet these stories didn't just make the airways, repeated by the BBC and most, broadsheet media. Because again, there's a cultural proclivity to err on the kind of most negative aspects of what could occur. In fact, there's many, again, the literature on disasters and emergencies shows that if anything, some communities can be better off after a disaster. There are numerous instances of people saying we were better off after that crisis because it brings people together in a way that contemporary society doesn't allow. In a society when all of our networks have been either corroded or have fallen by the wayside, and that's like political participation, trade unions, religious congregations, families, neighbourhoods, you name it, more than ever before people live life on their own. Oddly enough, disasters bring people together because you have to start looking out for, who can help, what can you do. And so whereas a disaster destroys physical capital and erodes economic capital, it's one of the rare instances in the contemporary world that can build up social capital. And when I say people are better off, there are numerous instances of villages saying we were better off. There's a classic case where a hurricane went through, a tornado down sort of Tornado Alley in America, hit one village, missed another. And the people in the village that were hit always said afterwards, we've got a better community spirit than that lot, because it brought us together and we suddenly found out what we all do. It kind of reaffirms basic human bonds. Although obviously in a rather unfortunate way, I wouldn't wish disasters upon communities to achieve that, and that's maybe something that we can discuss. However, again, because of the kind of negative pessimism of our times, the presumption is rather the reverse. The presumption being foisted inevitably on disasters is that people can't cope, that they're going to be traumatized, that there are vulnerable groups who will never recover, and that they need professional support, and that kind of feeds into the whole sort of psychotherapeutic resolution of difficulties and problems. With very little evidence for that. It's just a reinterpretation based by a kind of new, psychotherapeutic elite, in a way, who are trying to impose their assumptions about how we behave in disasters. Now, the funniest, if it weren't so sad, example of that, which is reported by Pupovac, who's a researcher at Nottingham University. She went out to Bosnia after, the Bosnian War, looking at the kind of reconstruction effort that was going on there. And what she found was that as part of the reconstruction effort, Britain had sent an army of therapeutic counsellors to help people recover from what they presumed would be trauma. And what she finds is that, as a percentage, more of those counsellors come back suffering from trauma than the people they went out to help, which she holds up to show how trauma itself is culturally constructed. It's based on your presumption of whether you're able to cope with difficult situations, and also whether there's the potential for some kind of financial compensation for your trauma, which obviously in Bosnia there's not. What they found was, people on the ground who wanted someone to help them rebuild their house or help them relocate their relatives, and found it rather odd that there was this group of people saying, are you having trouble sleeping at night? What do you dream about? And all sorts of bizarre questions that they not even started thinking about. So it's rather amusing that those counsellors come back feeling traumatised. 7th of July this year is also, I think, an example of how actually people are very positive in a difficult situation. I think, oddly enough, from the top down, from the Prime Minister through the emergency responders and the public, all behaved, remarkably well on the 7th of July itself. Now, the interesting thing is that after the immediacy of a disaster has abated, and the fact that you have to be more focused, you have to be cooperative, all of that begins to subside. And unfortunately, all the dominant cultural trends of our times then begin to remanifest themselves. And those dominant cultural trends are pessimism, the presumption of trauma. Famously, for instance, the fire department of New York, who were the heroes on 9/11, the heroes of the hour, 3 months later, they start putting in their claims for trauma and saying, they were forced to inhale fumes, they were forced to work longer hours than ever. So the heroes become zeros quite quickly because of the kind of cultural script that they live out. There's, attempts to fight, to attribute blame, mistrust of the authorities, obviously not made any better by the shooting of Menendez, after the 21st of July. But the interesting thing, in fact, is the 21st of July attacks in this country, nothing happened. They're almost farcical in that, they attempt to repeat exactly the 7th of July, but none of the bombs go off. And yet, the 21st of July becomes much more of a defining moment. Tony Blair, who after the 7th of July had said, we have to return to normality, people have got to get on with their lives, we won't give an inch to the terrorists. After the 21st of July, he starts throwing all our civil liberties out the window as quickly as he possibly can, saying, we're going to get rid of people who incite terror and who glorify terror, whatever those words are. And if you presume it's possible to legislate for that, you must be a greater mind than certainly I. Just want to conclude looking at our whole obsession with technical risk management. I mean, since the 11th of September 2001, really all of the efforts that's gone in has been entirely technical as far as I can make out in terms of dealing with terrorism. So there's a huge amount of money being poured into the need for better surveillance, more intelligence gathering, providing protection equipment to the emergency responders, gadgets to detect chemical and biological agents, despite the fact that every terrorist attack since the 11th of September and including the 11th of September, none of them have been chemical or biological. I mean, it's like that's us projecting our own worst fears onto something that hasn't happened. Terrorists continue to use surface-to-air missiles, car bombs, high explosives. There's been a lot of money poured into IT as well, profiling people and all various other things. But essentially all technical in character, as if the best we can do is to mitigate against some inevitable threat coming our way. And indeed, if you look at the rhetoric of all of the kind of major public authorities, it feeds into that idea. It's a question of when, not if. All of that. It's just the assumption is it's necessarily going to happen. And that's quite interesting because, again, in the stuff I've done over the years, I've pointed out that risk, the concept of risk, that if you look it up in the dictionary, ought to be both a verb and a noun, has increasingly shifted from being a verb to becoming a noun. In other words, in the past, we had quite a positive sense that risk was about how you engage with reality. It's an activity, you can risk doing something. You take a risk. And taking a risk yields opportunities and benefits as well as potential problems. Whereas today, when you see the word risk, and I guarantee you'll see it in any newspaper you go back to your office after this session and look in, you'll see that the word risk is always prefixed by the word at. People are at risk. They are at risk of something. In other words, risk has become a thing. It's become a noun. It's no longer an activity. It's no longer something that you do and engage with the world. It's just a thing in itself. And interestingly enough, that shift from being an active engagement to being a passive noun reflects the shift, I would argue, has happened in society from ourselves being active political agents to becoming passive voyeurs of a process that most of us are completely uninterested in as we disengage from political life. But looking at things that way actually enhances our sense of alienation. So I'll just conclude by saying that risk management is both insufficient and unambitious for dealing with these things. We did some work at King's, and this will be my very last point, comparing how societies have responded to different emergencies in different times. And you can compare like with like. For instance, we looked at flooding in southeast England in the 50s compared to more recent episodes of flooding, say in Oxford a few years ago. Or foot and mouth, the episode in 1967 compared to the episode in 2000-2001. So you've got essentially the same emergency, the same society, supposedly, but very different reactions. And the different reaction tells you how much culture has changed in a very short period of time. You're looking at 40 years, no more. Certainly, probably even less than a generation, I would argue. And we also looked at attitudes during the Blitz, obviously a period when Londoners were incessantly under attack, night after night, not just a one-off, killing 50 people, as happened this year. And attitudes to terrorism today, to say, what's changed in our culture, in our attitudes to risk and danger. And there's just a couple of pointers I'll leave you with. One is that in the past, there was a constant demand that life should return to normal as quickly as possible. Whereas today, there's a presumption that normality will never be restored, that people will be scarred for life. It's phrases that you'll see in all of the literature. And that it's simply not possible to assume that you can return to normality. It's also the case that in the past, there was an assumption that people were resilient, that they could pick themselves up, or that at least as a community that they would cope with what had happened to them. Whereas today the presumption is that people are vulnerable and that they're unable to cope on their own, that they need professional support. It's really interesting the huge burgeoning of professionals that now interfere and intervene the moment there's any kind of crisis. You have a shooting in a school in America or in this country, and suddenly the school is swamped by therapists, and irrespective of how children are behaving, but it's presumed that they have to seek professional support. It's also the case. The other lesson, I think, is looking at how the need to engage the public in dealing with its own crises and emergencies, because the danger by professionalizing everything is that you push people out and you actually prevent them from learning their own coping strategies. So what you have in an emergency is, despite the fact that people on the ground are the first responders, invariably, they are the first people helping one another. How do you think people from the Tokyo subway after the sarin gas attack got to hospital? There was not a fleet of ambulances waiting at ground level expecting an attack ready to take people to hospital. They were taken by private car, by people taking a risk because it was a chemical attack, but acting in a humane way and doing things for themselves. Whereas what happens in a disaster is that the yellow tape goes around the perimeter of the disaster and immediately people are pushed away and the professionals take over. And I think the one thing that disaster professionals have got to work out in the coming period is how to engage people's spontaneous and quite positive attempt to solve their own problems rather than continuously push them away. Where you might have a technically slick and professionally competent and possibly with fewer mistakes, but actually some mistakes might be a cost worth having if the benefit is rebuilding communities faster than would otherwise happen.
Mr. Durodie was asked the following 3 questions. Question 1. With regards to the idea that we are living in a pessimistic age, it seems that the media constantly give us bad news and we've come to expect only the bad. Would that be a fair assessment?
I'd never denied that the media have a role, and that what I think they do is they reflect dominant cultural trends very well. But by doing that, they tend to amplify them. There are a few instances where you could point to and say that it's the media per se. And let me give you a couple. Actually, let me just take a step back and say why I think we live in a slightly pessimistic age. I mean, and I've alluded to it in my discussion, actually. I think it's to do with the kind of breakdown of all the networks that people would have belonged to and would have affirmed your identity and given you a self of confidence. You know, in the past, you know, you'd have been a family person, you know, somebody in the community, you'd have been a member of some political party, trade union. I don't care, you know, religious congregation, I don't, you know, whatever. But the more those networks that affirmed who you are and provided people with meaning and identity, the more they have become eroded, the more people today, unlike any generation actually, in sort of post-Enlightenment history, live life on their own. And it's, you know, far easier to become worried and pessimistic when you're on your own than when you're in a network. You know, if I put you in the middle of Dartmoor at 3 o'clock in the morning on your own, it's a different experience to being there with 50 of your best friends. You know, when I start breaking twigs behind you, you know, even though the threat is no different, your perception of the threat, once you're isolated, is very different. And that's why we've become a kind of, I would argue, we don't live in a risk society, we live in a risk perception society due to the breakdown of social networks. And that lends itself to a number of unfortunate effects. A certain, you know, when you are on your own and you only have yourself, then it's necessarily you become a much more me generation as well, which we also see in society, that people are much more self-focused and obsessed with their health because that's the last thing they have left, you know. You know, all the sort of supposedly political debates of our time, you know, obesity, drinking, smoke. God, what a yawn, you know. They're all health. They're all focused on the only thing people have got left, which is themselves. But where I think the media comes in relation to this is that there are messages coming from, you know, government is not immune to these processes. They, you know, they have noticed that we are more isolated and insecure, and government itself, you know, sort of since the end of the Cold War, lacks a sense of purpose and accordingly a certain degree of legitimacy, you know, because their agenda's not clear. But then they notice that we're all isolated and insecure, and that gives them their new agenda, and their new agenda is to protect us from all our fears. Hence, we now have a regulatory state right across the board for everything, from eating beef to listening to mobile phones, you know. I mean, you look at the statute book or regulations, they've mushroomed since the mid-80s. I mean, remarkably, there was very little regulation about food, even until the mid-80s. You know, and amazingly, we didn't poison ourselves and kill everybody off as, you know, supermarkets competed to make things cheaper. You know, we used to put really nasty things in food in the past as it happened, like mercury and lead and arsenic. But anyway, so you can see that explosion of regulation has got much more to do with a crisis of confidence and trying to deal with that than it has to do with any objective indices of crises. But unfortunately, the state then becomes its own worst enemy, because it becomes, whilst it tries to set itself up as the risk regulator, you know, of last resort, it also becomes the risk amplifier of last resort, because it argues that everything is a risk, and that's why they're introducing legislation on this, legislation on that, because you're at threat from this, you're at threat from Sudan 1, despite the fact that Sudan 1 was in loads of food products that we all used to buy until only 2 years ago anyway. And everything else. And, you know, in relation to terrorism, for instance, I wouldn't blame the media directly, because you've got to bear in mind that the Health Protection Agency, which is, whilst at arm's length, is effectively still an arm of, you know, the government, issued numerous health advisories about how the public ought to behave in a chemical or biological attack, and they cascaded all the GPs in the country about how to spot the signs of Marburg fever and viral hemorrhagic, you know, all these obscure things, whereas most GPs are dealing with rather mundane things like colds and gonorrhea and, you know, stuff like that on a daily basis. And so they have set the climate, which the media then, when something apparently kicks off, like ricin, then the media has a frenzy. Although, interestingly enough, worth bearing in mind that there was never a trace of ricin found. And yet, most people don't know that, which I find remarkable.
Question 2. You talked about the relationship between the public as first respondents at a disaster and them being excluded once the professionals arrive. and that any mistakes the public may make may be worth having. But what about the risk of them being sued for compensation?
Well, the interesting thing about the compensation, though, is that compensation claims have gone up the more people have been kept away from dealing with things. So in fact, it's an inverse relationship. It's like, actually, once you're engaged and once you've got more of a sense of what's going on, you don't feel alienated. Compensation claims are to do with alienation from decision-making processes. It's precisely because I was kept out and then something went wrong that I want some money for that, because you pushed me out. Whereas you could actually begin a process of getting around that. I think looking forwards, what needs to happen, it's interesting, it's something I'm discussing with some friends of mine actually as a kind of project for this year, is we need a kind of new political framework. I personally think that the old left and the old right got us to the mess that we're in today. Neither of them got anything to offer. People in between don't exist anyway. What there's a need for is a kind of new, kind of humanist, positive project at this stage. It's actually, you can't have a political debate about anything until you have reminded people that humanity is a good thing. Because actually politics depends on moving collectivities and societies. But as long as we mistrust one another and we think that we're dangerous and that we're all potential paedophiles, but actually things are getting worse and worse at the moment. That process has got to be halted before we can even start anything beyond that.
Question 3. There has recently been a case where a male nurse suffering from Munchausen by proxy hurt several babies. Why is it that as a result of this, no nurse can now be employed in a hospital if they have any history of mental disorder, even something as simple as postnatal depression? And yet children are far more at risk from mothers with Munchausen by proxy, of which there are several cases a year.
Well, more and more what happens is we focus on extremes. And society becomes obsessed with extremes, and then it legislates as if the extremes were normal. And then the most corrosive consequence of that is that what is actually normal becomes marginalised. And so the fact that on a normal day we don't go around killing each other and we don't go around doing all these horrible things and there aren't catastrophes all the time goes unspoken. And legislation and regulation and society is organised around extreme events that actually there's nothing to learn from, ironically. There's this obsession that you have to learn the lessons from this catastrophe. Most of the time there's very little that you can learn from certain catastrophes because they are unique.
Bill Durodie can be contacted by email at w.durodie, that's Durodie, at cranfield.ac.uk.